The sun was shining brightly over a small, peaceful town surrounded by lush green hills. It was the kind of day that seemed made for celebrations, and indeed, the entire community had gathered to witness what many called the wedding of the year. Sarah Bennett, a kind-hearted woman in her early 30s, was about to marry Michael Carter, a charming man who had swept her off her feet after years of being a single mother. Her son, Ethan, stood quietly near the front row, dressed neatly in his suit, watching as guests took their seats under a flower-adorned archway. Sarah looked breathtaking in her ivory gown, her hair styled softly around her face. She held a bouquet of white roses, each petal perfectly arranged. As she walked down the aisle with her father, tears glistened in her eyes, not just from happiness, but also from relief. For so long, she had raised Ethan alone, working tirelessly to provide for him while putting her own dreams on hold. Now, at last, it felt like life was finally giving her a second chance at love. Everyone could see how much she adored Michael, and he appeared to return those feelings wholeheartedly. Michael stood tall at the altar, smiling warmly as Sarah approached him. His dark suit fit perfectly, and his tie matched the color of the flowers decorating the venue. To most people, he seemed like the ideal partner, attentive, caring, and successful. He had quickly won over Sarah's family and friends during their courtship, attending dinners, helping out with chores, and even coaching Ethan's soccer team. But despite all this, something about Michael didn't sit right with Ethan. Ethan wasn't one to jump to conclusions. At 10 years old, he was smart beyond his years, observant, and deeply protective of his mom. Over the past few months, though, he'd noticed things that troubled him. Little things, like how Michael would suddenly change the subject whenever someone asked about his childhood or why he never talked about his previous job. Then there were bigger things, like the hushed phone calls Michael made late at night when he thought everyone was asleep. Once, Ethan had accidentally stumbled upon an open laptop screen showing photos of Michael standing beside a woman who looked nothing like Sarah. They were laughing together, arms wrapped around each other in celebration. The caption beneath the photo read, "Happy Anniversary." At first, Ethan tried to convince himself that he was imagining things. Maybe the pictures were old, or maybe the woman was just a friend. But doubts lingered in his mind, growing stronger with each passing day. He wanted to tell his mom what he'd seen, but fear held him back. What if he was wrong? Worse yet, what if he ruined the happiest moment of her life? Still, the unease gnawed at him relentlessly. As the ceremony began, Ethan fidgeted nervously in his seat. Around him, guests whispered excitedly, commenting on how beautiful the decorations were or how radiant Sarah looked. A string quartet played soft music in the background, adding to the magical atmosphere. Yet Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He glanced at his mom, who beamed with joy, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her son's heart. And then he looked at Michael, whose smile seemed almost too perfect, too practiced. With every word spoken by the officiant, Ethan's anxiety grew. By the time the vows started, his hands were clammy, and his heart pounded in his chest. He knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. If no one else suspected anything, then it was up to him to protect his mom, even if it meant doing something drastic. Clutching a folded piece of paper in his pocket, the result of weeks of careful observation, he braced himself for what he was about to do. Whatever happened next, he told himself, would be worth it if it meant keeping his mom safe. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight streaming through the curtains of Sarah's small but cozy home. Ethan woke up earlier than usual, his mind racing with thoughts that had kept him tossing and turning all night. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the crumpled piece of paper he'd been carrying around for days. It was filled with scribbles, notes he jotted down whenever something about Michael seemed off. Some entries were short, like Michael hung up fast when someone called him honey, while others were longer observations, such as how Michael always avoided answering direct questions about his family or past relationships. Ethan knew he couldn't ignore what he'd discovered anymore. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that Michael wasn't being honest. But what could a 10-year-old boy do? He didn't have proof, just fragments of information pieced together from late-night phone calls, strange photos online, and overheard conversations. Still, Ethan felt a deep responsibility to protect his mom. She had worked so hard to give him a good life, sacrificing her own happiness for years. If Michael was lying to her, Ethan couldn't let her go through with the wedding without knowing the truth. He unfolded the note again, smoothing out the creases on his lap. Over the past week, he'd rewritten it several times, trying to make sure every detail was clear. At the top, he'd written in block letters, "You're not who you say you are." Below that, he listed everything he'd noticed: the anniversary photo he'd seen on Michael's laptop, the secretive phone calls, and even the way Michael sometimes flinched when asked simple questions about his hometown. Ethan didn't fully understand all of it, but he was certain it added up to something important. As the hours ticked by, Ethan watched his mom get ready in her room. She hummed softly to herself, occasionally glancing at her reflection in the mirror with a dreamy smile. Seeing her so happy made Ethan hesitate. What if he was wrong? What if this destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to her? His stomach churned at the thought, but he reminded himself why he was doing this. Love meant protecting the people you cared about, even if it hurt them temporarily. By the time they arrived at the venue, Ethan's nerves were stretched thin. Guests milled about, chatting and admiring the decorations. Children ran across the grass, laughing and playing tag. Despite the festive atmosphere, Ethan felt completely out of place, as though he were watching the world move forward while he stood frozen in time. He clutched the note tightly in his pocket, rehearsing what he would say if anyone asked why he interrupted the ceremony. Deep down, he hoped no one would ask. He wasn't sure he could explain it himself. When the officiant began speaking, Ethan's heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. He glanced at his mom, who looked radiant in her gown, and then at Michael, whose confident posture only fueled Ethan's unease. Something inside him snapped. This wasn't right. No matter how scared he was, he couldn't stay silent. He had promised himself, and his mom, that he would always stand up for what was true. Taking a deep breath, Ethan slipped the note into his hand and clenched his fists. As the officiant reached the part where anyone could object to the marriage, Ethan shot to his feet. Time seemed to slow as all eyes turned toward him. For a brief moment, panic gripped him. What if no one believed him? What if they laughed it off as childish nonsense? But then he remembered the look on his mom's face whenever she talked about Michael. The hope, the trust, the love. That gave him courage. Without another thought, Ethan stepped forward, his legs trembling beneath him. He walked straight toward the altar, ignoring the gasps and murmurs rippling through the crowd. Reaching Michael, he held out the note, his voice barely above a whisper. "Read this," he said firmly, his young face set with determination. Everyone froze, unsure of what to say or do next. Whatever happened now, Ethan knew he'd done the right thing, even if it cost him everything. The air at the wedding venue was thick with anticipation as Sarah and Michael stood side by side under the flower-adorned archway. The string quartet played softly in the background, their melodies blending seamlessly with the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Guests exchanged smiles, some leaning in to whisper predictions about how perfect the couple seemed together. Everything appeared to be unfolding like a scene from a fairy tale, until Ethan's sudden movement shattered the calm. Just as the officiant reached the part of the ceremony where he asked if anyone objected to the union, Ethan bolted upright from his seat. His small frame moved quickly, almost too fast for anyone to react. Gasps rippled through the crowd like waves, and heads turned in unison to watch him sprint toward the altar. No one could believe what they were seeing, a child interrupting such a sacred moment. Whispers erupted around the gathering. What is he doing? Is this some kind of prank? Oh no, something must be wrong. Ethan didn't hear any of it. His focus was entirely on Michael, who stood frozen at the altar, confusion etched across his face. As Ethan approached, his heart thudded wildly in his chest, threatening to burst out of his ribcage. He felt every pair of eyes on him, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting the note into Michael's hands. Reaching the front, Ethan stopped abruptly, his breaths coming in short, uneven bursts. For a split second, he hesitated, suddenly aware of how absurd this must look. But then he remembered why he was there, to protect his mom, and found the strength to push forward. "Here," Ethan said firmly, thrusting the folded piece of paper into Michael's hand. His voice wavered slightly, betraying his nervousness, but his expression remained resolute. Michael blinked down at him, stunned. He glanced at Sarah, whose wide eyes mirrored his own shock, before slowly unfolding the note. The officiant paused mid-sentence, unsure whether to continue or address the disruption. Silence fell over the venue, broken only by the faint chirping of birds in the distance. Ethan stepped back slightly, his hands trembling as he clasped them behind his back. He looked up at his mom, searching her face for a reaction. Sarah stared at him, her mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to process what was happening. Her bouquet of white roses drooped slightly in her grasp, forgotten for the moment. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she turned her gaze to Michael, waiting for an explanation. As Michael read the note, his smile faded completely. His brow furrowed, and his hands tightened around the paper until his knuckles turned white. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and visibly shaken. He glanced at Ethan again, this time with an expression that bordered on anger, but beneath it lay traces of guilt. Whatever was written on that note had struck a nerve. The tension in the air became unbearable. Sarah finally found her voice, though it trembled as she spoke. "Michael, what is this?" she asked, her tone laced with uncertainty. Her eyes darted between her son and her fiancé, trying to piece together what was going on. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some leaning forward to get a better view, others exchanging worried glances. A few whispered audibly, speculating about what the note might say. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding harder than ever. He hadn't planned beyond handing over the note, and now he felt exposed, vulnerable. What if Michael denied everything? What if everyone thought Ethan was overreacting? Doubt crept into his mind, but he pushed it aside. He reminded himself of all the things he'd noticed, the secretive phone calls, the mysterious photos, the inconsistencies in Michael's stories. This wasn't just a hunch, it was real. For a long, agonizing moment, no one spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Michael to respond. When he finally did, his voice cracked under the weight of the situation. "Sarah, I can explain," he began, but his words trailed off as he realized the gravity of the stares directed at him. Every eye in the venue was fixed on him now, demanding answers. And deep down, Ethan knew he had uncovered something big, something that couldn't be ignored. The silence that followed Michael's shaky declaration was deafening. Every guest sat motionless, their expressions a mix of shock, curiosity, and disbelief. Sarah's face turned pale as she stared at the note in Michael's trembling hands. Her grip on the bouquet loosened further, and the flowers slipped from her fingers, landing softly on the ground with a muted thud. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The cheerful atmosphere that had filled the venue just moments ago had vanished, replaced by an uneasy tension so thick you could almost touch it. Michael hesitated, his lips parting as if to speak, but producing no sound. His eyes darted nervously between Sarah and Ethan, searching for some way to salvage the situation. Finally, he cleared his throat and attempted to compose himself. "Sarah," he began again, his voice strained, "this isn't what it looks like." But before he could continue, Ethan spoke up, his small yet firm voice cutting through the air like a knife. "It says everything right there," he said, pointing at the note still clutched in Michael's hand. "You're not who you say you are. You're already married." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, silencing any attempt Michael might have made to deflect or downplay the accusation. Sarah's head whipped toward her son, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked back at Michael, her expression pleading for him to deny it, to tell her that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But instead of reassuring her, Michael's face crumpled under the weight of guilt. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. "It's true," Michael admitted finally, his voice heavy with shame. I haven't finalized my divorce yet." His confession sent ripples of murmurs through the crowd. Some guests exchanged horrified glances, while others leaned closer, eager to hear more. Sarah staggered backward slightly, her knees threatening to give out beneath her. One of her bridesmaids rushed forward to steady her, wrapping an arm around her waist. Ethan stepped forward, his young voice rising with emotion. "That's not all," he said, looking directly at Michael. "I saw pictures online. You were celebrating an anniversary with someone else, and you've been lying about where you go when you leave late at night. You think we wouldn't find out, but I did." Each word felt like a hammer striking against Michael's carefully constructed facade. The man who had seemed so charming and dependable just moments ago now appeared fragile and exposed. Sarah turned to Michael, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Is this true?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Were you ever going to tell me, or were you planning to keep lying to me forever?" Michael opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he bowed his head, defeated. The truth was written all over his face. He had been caught red-handed, and there was no escaping it now. The guests watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to feel sympathy for Sarah or disdain for Michael. A few people stood up, murmuring apologies as they quietly exited the venue, unwilling to witness the fallout. As the reality of the situation sank in, Sarah collapsed into a nearby chair, her hands covering her face. Her dreams of a fresh start, of finally finding happiness after years of raising Ethan alone, lay shattered at her feet. Yet amidst the chaos, one thing stood out: Ethan's bravery. Despite his fear, despite the risk of ruining the day, he had spoken up because he loved his mom enough to protect her, even from herself. The officiant, clearly unsure how to proceed, closed his book and stepped away from the altar. The string quartet stopped playing altogether, leaving only the sound of rustling leaves and distant birdsong. The beautiful decorations that had once symbolized love and new beginnings now felt hollow, a cruel reminder of what could have been. For Ethan, standing there amid the wreckage of the wedding, the weight of what he had done began to settle in. He hadn't wanted to cause pain, but he knew he couldn't stand by and let his mom marry someone who wasn't honest with her. As tears welled up in his own eyes, he realized that sometimes doing the right thing meant making hard choices and living with the consequences. After the shocking revelation at the altar, the atmosphere grew heavy with tension. Sarah, still reeling from Michael's confession, insisted they retreat to a private space to talk things through. A nearby tent, originally set up for refreshments, became the unlikely venue for what would be one of the most emotional confrontations of their lives. The air inside was stifling despite the open flaps, and the cheerful tablecloths adorned with flowers seemed incongruous against the somber mood. Ethan followed behind silently, clutching his hands tightly together, as if trying to keep himself grounded. He had done what he believed was right, but now doubt crept in. Would his mom understand? Or would she feel betrayed by his actions on what should have been the happiest day of her life? His heart raced as he watched her sit down across from Michael, her face pale but resolute. She gestured for Ethan to join them, pulling him close to her side. Her arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders, though it was unclear whether she was comforting him or drawing strength from his presence. "Explain," Sarah said firmly, her voice trembling but unwavering. She locked eyes with Michael, who shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. For the first time, his usual charm seemed stripped away, leaving behind only a man cornered by his own lies. He hesitated before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "I never meant to hurt you, Sarah," Michael began, his tone laced with desperation. When we met, I thought maybe this could work. My marriage, it's complicated. We've been separated for years, but finalizing the divorce has been difficult. He paused, glancing at Ethan briefly before continuing. I didn't want anything to ruin what we had. I thought I could fix everything before it got too serious. Sarah shook her head slowly, disbelief etched into every line of her face. Too serious. Michael, we're standing here today because you asked me to marry you. You made promises, to me, to Ethan. And all along, you knew you weren't free to make them. Her voice cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. How could you do this? Before Michael could respond, Ethan spoke up, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. It's not just about the divorce, he said softly, looking directly at Michael. You lied about other things too. Like that picture I saw. The one where you were celebrating an anniversary with someone else. And those late-night calls. His voice trailed off, but the weight of his words hung in the air. Michael sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. That was my wife. Ex-wife. He corrected himself quickly. She called because she needed help with some legal paperwork. It wasn't personal. As for the pictures, yes, they're real, but they're old. That was years ago, long before I met you. But Sarah wasn't convinced. You kept so much hidden from me, she said, her voice rising slightly. Every little detail I tried to learn about your past, you brushed aside. Every question I asked, you dodged. How can I trust anything you say now? Ethan reached out to take his mom's hand, squeezing it gently. Mom, I didn't mean to ruin your day, he whispered, his voice breaking. I wanted to protect you. I couldn't let you go through with this if something wasn't right. Sarah turned to look at her son, her expression softening. Tears streamed down her face, but there was no anger in her eyes, only love and gratitude. Oh, sweetheart, she murmured, pulling him into a tight hug. You didn't ruin anything. If anything, you saved me from making a huge mistake. She kissed the top of his head, holding him close as if to shield him from the world. For Michael, the moment was unbearable. He sat quietly, watching the bond between mother and son unfold before him. Whatever hope he might have harbored of salvaging the relationship crumbled completely. There was no coming back from this, not after betraying Sarah's trust so profoundly. After a long pause, he stood up, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I'll leave, he said quietly, avoiding eye contact with either of them. Clearly, this isn't the right place for me anymore. Without waiting for a response, he walked out of the tent, disappearing into the crowd outside. As the reality of what had happened settled in, Sarah wiped her tears and took a deep breath. The pain was still raw, but amidst the heartbreak, she felt a flicker of relief. Thanks to Ethan's courage, she had avoided tying her life to someone who wasn't truthful. Now she realized it was time to focus on healing and rebuilding her life with the person who mattered most, her son. The days following the wedding that never was were a blur of emotions for Sarah. She retreated to her cozy home, seeking solace in familiar surroundings as she processed everything that had happened. Boxes of decorations and half-packed suitcases sat untouched in corners, reminders of plans that would never come to fruition. The house felt quieter than usual, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Instead, it gave her space to think, to grieve, and to begin piecing herself back together. Ethan stayed close by her side during those first difficult days, sensing his mom's need for support without her having to say a word. He helped with small tasks around the house, tidying up, making toast for breakfast, even watering the plants on the windowsill. Though he was only 10 years old, Ethan carried himself with a maturity beyond his years, knowing instinctively when to offer comfort and when to simply be present. His actions spoke louder than any words could, and they brought Sarah immeasurable comfort. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Sarah sat with Ethan on their porch swing. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers from the garden next door. For a long time, neither of them spoke, content to listen to the rhythmic creak of the swing and the distant chirping of crickets. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Ethan," she began softly, her voice tinged with both sadness and gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you." She reached over to hold his hand, her fingers warm against his. "You were so brave that day. Most kids your age wouldn't have known what to do, or wouldn't have dared to speak up. But you did. You saved me from making a huge mistake." Ethan looked down at their intertwined hands, his cheeks flushing slightly. "I just wanted to protect you, Mom," he replied quietly. "I didn't want you to get hurt." Sarah smiled through her tears, pulling him into a tight hug. "And you did protect me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Even if it meant ruining the day, you put my happiness first. That takes courage and love. So much love." She kissed the top of his head, holding him close as if to shield him from the world. In the weeks that followed, Sarah leaned heavily on her support system, her parents, her closest friends, and especially Ethan. They rallied around her, offering kind words, home-cooked meals, and distractions when the weight of heartbreak threatened to overwhelm her. One afternoon, Sarah's best friend Lisa came over with a stack of board games and insisted they spend the day laughing instead of crying. At first, Sarah hesitated, unsure if she was ready to move past the pain. But as the hours passed and giggles filled the room, she realized how healing joy could be. Meanwhile, news of Ethan's heroic act spread throughout the community. Neighbors who had attended the ill-fated wedding stopped by to express their admiration for the boy who had shown such remarkable bravery. Some brought homemade pies, others left notes of encouragement tucked into their mailbox. Even strangers heard about the story and praised Ethan for standing up for what was right. Though he tried to brush off the attention, secretly, he felt proud, not because people were calling him a hero, but because he had made a difference. As time went on, Sarah began to see the silver linings in the situation. Yes, she had been hurt, deeply so, but she had also gained clarity. Michael's betrayal had forced her to confront truths she might otherwise have ignored, and in doing so, it strengthened her resolve to prioritize honesty and trust moving forward. More importantly, the experience reminded her of the unshakable bond she shared with Ethan. Through every high and low, they had faced life's challenges together and emerged stronger for it. One evening, as they sat together watching a movie, Sarah turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "we don't need anyone else to complete us. We've got each other, and that's more than enough." Ethan nodded, his lips curving into a small smile. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with Ethan by her side, she knew they could handle anything life threw their way. Together, mother and son began rebuilding, not just their routines, but their dreams. Slowly but surely, they found joy again, rediscovering the beauty of simple moments and cherishing the love that had carried them through the storm. Months had passed since the dramatic events of that unforgettable wedding day, and life in Sarah and Ethan's household had settled into a new rhythm. The initial sting of betrayal had faded, replaced by a quiet determination to focus on what truly mattered: their bond as a family. Sarah threw herself into her work, finding fulfillment in her career as a graphic designer, while also dedicating more time to hobbies she'd neglected over the years. She took up painting again, filling canvases with vibrant colors that seemed to mirror her journey toward healing. Ethan, too, embraced this fresh chapter in their lives. He became more confident, not just because of the praise he'd received from neighbors and strangers, but because he knew he'd done something meaningful. His classmates at school teased him good-naturedly about being the kid who stopped a wedding, but Ethan didn't mind. If anything, it made him feel like a small-town legend. And secretly, he liked that. More importantly, though, he felt closer to his mom than ever before. Their nightly talks on the porch swing became a cherished tradition, where they shared stories, laughter, and sometimes even tears. One crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah decided it was time to revisit the hillside venue where the wedding had been planned. She hadn't returned since that fateful day, and while the thought of going back stirred mixed emotions, she felt ready to face it. Ethan agreed to join her, curious about how the place would feel now that so much time had passed. Together, they drove to the site, the golden leaves crunching beneath their feet as they stepped out of the car. The once decorated archway was bare now, its wooden frame weathered by months of wind and rain. The flower beds that had bloomed so vibrantly during the ceremony were beginning to wilt, their petals scattered across the ground. Yet despite the changes, there was a certain beauty in the simplicity of the landscape. It no longer felt like a place tied to heartbreak. Instead, it felt peaceful, almost serene. Sarah carried a kite with her, a gift Ethan had insisted on bringing along. "We should do something fun today," he'd said earlier, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Something to remind us we can still have happy memories here." Sarah couldn't argue with that logic, so they set up the kite together, letting the brisk breeze carry it high into the sky. Its bright colors danced against the clouds, a vivid contrast to the muted tones of the surrounding hills. As they watched the kite soar, Sarah wrapped an arm around Ethan's shoulders. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I used to think I needed someone else to make my life complete, that I couldn't be happy unless I found the one. But now I realize how wrong I was." She paused, looking down at her son with a tender smile. "I already have everything I need right here, with you." Ethan grinned, leaning into her embrace. "Does that mean no more weddings?" he asked jokingly, raising an eyebrow. Sarah laughed, ruffling his hair playfully. "Not anytime soon, buddy. Right now, I'm perfectly happy just being your mom, and letting you save me from bad decisions every once in a while." Their shared laughter echoed through the open space, mingling with the sound of rustling leaves and fluttering kite strings. For the first time in months, Sarah felt genuinely free. Free from the weight of regret, free from the pressure to conform to society's expectations, and free to live life on her own terms. She wasn't alone either. Ethan stood steadfastly by her side, a reminder that love came in many forms, not just romantic ones. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hillside, mother and son packed up their things and headed back to the car. The kite trailed behind them, its tail brushing gently against the grass. Though the day marked the end of one chapter, it also signaled the beginning of another, one filled with hope, resilience, and countless possibilities. Together, they drove home, leaving behind the remnants of the past and stepping boldly into the future. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and Ethan continued to create new traditions. They baked cookies on rainy afternoons, explored hiking trails on weekends, and spent lazy Sundays watching old movies under a blanket fort. Each moment, no matter how ordinary, became extraordinary because they shared it with each other. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was theirs, and that was enough. The seasons continued to change, bringing with them a sense of renewal and growth for Sarah and Ethan. Winter arrived, blanketing the town in soft snow that sparkled like diamonds under the pale sunlight. The world seemed quieter during those cold months, but inside their cozy home, warmth radiated from every corner. Sarah strung fairy lights along the windowsills, filling the rooms with a gentle glow that made even the darkest evenings feel inviting. Ethan built elaborate snow forts in the backyard, often dragging his mom outside to join him in impromptu snowball fights. Their laughter echoed through the frosty air, melting away any lingering shadows of the past. By spring, life had taken on a rhythm that felt steady and fulfilling. Sarah's painting hobby had blossomed into something more. A local cafe agreed to display her artwork, and she found joy in seeing strangers admire her creations. One Saturday morning, as they walked together to the cafe for the unveiling of her first solo exhibit, Ethan beamed with pride. "Mom, you're basically famous now," he teased, nudging her playfully. Sarah rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her smile. For so long, she'd put others' needs before her own dreams. But now she realized how much happiness came from pursuing what truly mattered to her. Ethan, too, was growing in ways that amazed Sarah. His teachers praised his maturity and leadership skills, noting how he always stood up for classmates who needed support. At soccer practice, he encouraged teammates who struggled, reminding them not to give up. When Sarah asked him where he got such wisdom, he shrugged and said simply, "I just think about how I'd want someone to help me if I were in their shoes." It was a lesson she knew he'd learned partly from protecting her, and partly from the bond they shared. One sunny afternoon, as they sat together on their porch swing, Sarah turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she began, "you taught me something really important this year." Ethan tilted his head, curious. "You showed me that love isn't just about romance or finding the perfect person. Love is about honesty, trust, and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Ethan grinned, clearly pleased. "Well, you taught me stuff too," he replied, "like how to make pancakes without burning them." They both burst out laughing, the sound carrying across the quiet neighborhood. But beneath the humor lay a deeper truth. They had grown together, learning from each other in ways neither could have anticipated. As summer approached, the hills surrounding their town came alive with wildflowers, painting the landscape in vibrant shades of yellow, purple, and pink. On one particularly warm weekend, Sarah suggested they revisit the hillside venue once again, not to dwell on the past, but to celebrate how far they'd come. This time, they'd brought a picnic basket filled with sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade. Sitting side by side on a checkered blanket, they watched the horizon stretch endlessly before them. "You remember that kite we flew here last fall?" Sarah asked, pointing to the sky where it had soared so freely. "It reminded me of us, how we've been able to rise above everything that tried to hold us down." Ethan nodded, squinting at the clouds. "Yeah, and look at us now. We're doing pretty good, huh?" "We are," Sarah agreed, her voice soft but full of conviction. She reached over to squeeze his hand. "No matter what happens in life, we'll keep rising, together." The years ahead wouldn't always be easy. They never were, but Sarah and Ethan faced them with courage and resilience. They celebrated victories, big and small, and leaned on each other during challenges. Friends and family marveled at the strength of their bond, calling them an inspiration. And though Sarah occasionally dated, she no longer rushed into relationships, knowing she already had everything she needed in her son. On the same hillside years later, as Ethan prepared to leave for college, Sarah handed him a small box containing a note. Inside, she had written, "To my brave boy, you've always been my hero. No matter where life takes you, remember we'll always have this hill, these skies, and our unbreakable connection." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he hugged her tightly. "Thanks, Mom," he whispered, "for everything." And as they stood there together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they knew their story wasn't ending. It was evolving. Through love, honesty, and unwavering support, they had created a life rich with meaning and purpose. Whatever the future held, they would face it side by side, ready to soar like the kites they once flew on that very hill.